Okay, let's begin our class meeting. We're calling this Lab 5, although it's really um, sort of just a makeup class where we have to get through a couple of topics. One is presenting the final exam. So I wanted to have this on recorded so anybody can go back and see the things I said as I talk about sort of the process. And then the second thing we'll do is cover our introduction to parametric programming. So um, we have a couple things here to do. The first thing we'll do is I basically sort of outline the final exam so that you can understand the procedure and how we'll get through the next few weeks to where you'll finally be presenting your own results to the class, answering some questions, and that will qualify as your final exam. Okay, so our final exam topic is going to be on diet modeling. So just to give you an idea, we have replicated one diet model, the Stigler subsistence model, and we looked at that as a way of comparing food data, but also sort of this it was a way to look at a sort of larger data model in GAMS. So now we're going to get into the sort of nuts and bolts of that, think about it a little bit, and treat it as our replication assignment, but then also something that you would develop your own question for. So with that, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, so an example problem statement might be, this is some constant food dollar expenditures over a 30-year period from USDA, tracking food away from home spending versus food at home spending. And so we have a blue line here and a red line, and you see the red line eclipsing that. And so basically the problem statement says food away from home expenditures have surpassed those food at home in recent years despite the added cost of preparation, right? It is more, the food away from home per unit of nutrition costs more. We know that because you're paying for other things. You're paying the service cost. And so the note here says that this indicates food or the nutrition costs plus the outlays of meal preparation and food away from home must be competitive with what we would call the full cost of home meal preparation for the average household. This is right. I mean, this would boil down to an average food away from home expense if you divide it by every household. And so the point of the extension work that I would like to do with the nutrition problem is to think about a diet model that gives me cost comparisons between food at home choices and food away from home choices. And if we exclusively model one with food at home and exclusively model the other with food away from home, then the cost difference, the minimum cost difference for those two, should give us some kind of benchmark that says what is the added cost of eating away from home, and then that would give us a value of the average or representative household's time for meal prep. And there are all kinds of things we might think about doing there. We might think about comparing it to the wages paid to food service workers. We might think about comparing it to the average household sort of internal wage, what kind of expected time we think they have. We could even add time constraints to our model to try to think about what the marginal value of time is for that representative household eating away from home versus preparing their food at home. All we need to add are some time coefficients to every food meal preparation that we sort of build into the model. So that's where we're headed. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to come up with this sort of fleshed out problem statement that a model of cost and food with nutrition constraints could help us identify. So I don't want us to feel, that's why I start with this sort of example problem statement, I don't want us to feel bound up by the Stigler paper, even though your first assignment working towards the final exam is going to be to replicate that with some updated or modernized cost and nutrition content. Okay, so as we go through towards the final project, assignment 3 and assignment 4 are both what we would call steps or stages towards getting to the final project. Assignment 3 will ask you to replicate the Stigler subsistence analysis, and this will be considered preliminary to your final project. So there's some collected data on the class website. You can collect your own. There's a reference on the class website for recommended daily requirements of different nutrition information, or you could go to some other source, especially if you wanted to think about some specialized diet. Once we get beyond assignment 3, so assignment 3 will be due November 7th, and I'll pull up the document for that and talk through it a little bit. But once we get beyond assignment 3 and you've submitted that on the 7th of November, we're going to extend the subsistence problem to some new research question like I just mentioned. So the idea of just open everything back up and think about, one, the example I just gave on cost of food away from home, and what does it mean to get those differences in costs? How would you interpret that? And that interpretation needs to be sort of prepared as not technically in a hypothesis format, but in an assertion or a declaration of part of the problem statement, so that it's clear how the model design, whether it's comparing two different diet models or some set of constraints that you've incorporated into your diet model, how those track to something that you want to measure and sort of confirm or fail to confirm in the model results. So the food away from home is obviously an interesting one, or one that is pretty easy to sort of consider how to implement. You might do some cost-benefit analysis of some diet that's sort of popular in marketing schemes. So maybe thinking about the opportunity cost of keto diet constraints. So that would be a model that looked at sort of a basic diet with sort of perfunctory right-hand side requirements on different nutrition, and then compared to the keto diet, which is going to be this low-carb, high-fat diet requirements, right? So it probably has some ratio. I don't know it that well. I just know I see it talked about a lot. And so it probably requires some ratio between fat and carbs, with fat being larger than the other ones. And is that a cheaper diet or a more expensive diet? And so you'd have to compare it to some basic diet. Measuring dietary costs of some kind of health concern or health conscious consumer. Thinking about heart healthy. So a person that is in that situation may face extra diet costs by trying to avoid certain foods that are sort of the cheapest nutritional supply. So they may have to spend a little more, but then of course the relevant cost comparison isn't just the cost of eating what you want, or the lowest cost way versus the heart healthy way. It's potentially preventative to much higher health costs. And then you can think about GHG, sort of the carbon footprint of the diet. So if you had some life cycle estimates, which are published in lots of places for different food ingredients, essentially this is sort of what's the carbon history of the production of this food item, specifically maybe for a ruminant animal, right, that has a methane output sort of associated with this life cycle. What happens if you think about the cost of sort of the normal diet versus the minimized GHG carbon footprint diet, and what is the difference in those two costs, and what does that say about how we might price carbon in the economy if we were to try to internalize those externalized costs? So I've seen that one done a couple times. So at this point, let me switch over and show you a couple of the documents. Okay, here's your Lab 5 document. It just basically says introducing the final exam. assignment 3 is one of the steps to getting there, and then our final topic is parametric programming. So yeah, if you look through this, thinking ahead to the final exam portion, the deliverables will be a presentation during dead week, a document that you have to submit by the Wednesday of finals week, basically just documenting your work and maybe stating your problem statement and conclusions. And then of course there'll be 2 stages, so assignment 3 and assignment 4. Assignment 3 instructions start on page 3 of the document for this lab handout. What we're looking for in the final exam would be this sort of document you've already presented, gotten some feedback, and then you'll have till the Wednesday of finals week to submit your final document where you clearly state the problem statement, give a clear indication of what is trying to be answered, document the data. That includes the right hand side plus the choice variables, how the objective equation is constructed, how the constraint equations are constructed, basically enough information that someone could reproduce or go out and independently confirm your work. Analysis with maybe some recommendation if you're doing sort of a pure planning model, but if you're doing sort of an economic analysis, then what kind of economic relationship have you uncovered? How does it answer your question? And what is the sort of appropriate interpretation? And then how does that interpretation contribute, right, to sort of what larger economic questions in the area of diet or in other areas, right? So if you are specifically thinking about that home versus away food consumption, and you are focused on the true cost of the true marginal cost of meal away from home, and you want to compare that to the average sort of service worker, what can you say about their capture of benefits there compared to the food submissions, right? So that would be more of a labor economics finding or contribution. If you were thinking about some health diet, it would be more of you'd have to look to the health economics sort of findings and discussion to think about that as a contribution. Yeah. So we're not going to do a lot of detailed research paper here, but we are going to try to contextualize whatever we get. So procedures, I'll get you the final procedures for when the final exam and how it's delivered. Sorry, the final paper has to be uploaded and when. It'll be the Wednesday of finals week, but how to get that submitted before the November holiday, and then we'll get the schedule for presentations before that as well. And this says you are not required to do a literature review, but your document should include anything that you think is relevant for making some kind of comparison. So if you want to compare to something that's published, whether it's literature, academic literature, or just something that's been published, we do need to document any of that. And it also would include any sourcing for the data that you build in. I've added a bibliography here just to get people started thinking about the final project. So it's on page 6 of this document, just to give you an idea of some of the things that's out there in the writing, and as well as a couple of book chapters that on linear programming, sort of talking about the origin of this as a study. Grading the project presentation is basically going to be graded as though it's a final exam where you develop the exam question. So I've given you some parameters. Basically, you have to stay in the area of diet and nutrition. You can branch out the economic model however you want to answer your own research question or your own problem statement sort of questions, but I need to be able to come up with a way of comparing people's work. And so as long as we're in the sort of same field of there being some nutrition constraints and some objective that can be tracked to cost or comparative cost, then we'll be fine, and I'll be able to sort of fairly evaluate everyone's work as an exam rather than sort of having to get too deep into how clever or complex you've developed your question, which you are certainly encouraged to go as far and to be as innovative as you like, but I want to be clear on what the grading will be, and we'll come up with a grading rubric that you can look to and think about. Okay, so on page 3 here in this document is assignment 3. Basically, it's replication analysis. So take the general thrust of what Stigler did in I don't know what year it was, 46 maybe, and redo that. Redo that with some data that's from now, and think about how that has changed. How does it compare? Whatever. And so you can see here, Stigler's diet solution. I think this is from the Wikipedia page on Stigler. Basically saying $40 a year, and this would be the sort of lowest cost way to get this. He's really thinking about the cost of nutrition, right? Not sort of putting together meals for people. These are the requirements that he made on a per day basis, and so that's sort of the notion that we're going to take, and we're going to work on a replication. So what do we have? Well, we have some data. So if you do not want to, if you want to just sort of treat this assignment 3 as just grab some data, put things together, and sort of solve and get your replication out of the way, and then keep thinking a bit about how you're going to tailor your final exam. We have a spreadsheet that's posted with this lab. There's about 200 food items, and a former PhD student of mine who teaches a undergrad math programming class had her students collect this data. So they were required to go out and provide the information you see in that spreadsheet, and the information in the spreadsheet looks like this. So everything will have a long name that gives the description, and then some abbreviation that would just be the sort of the code, like a variable code. And then you'll see a blank area in the spreadsheet for the choice variable, and that'll be blank so that you can model directly in the spreadsheet. So we'll look at that in a second. Calories, fat, sodium, carbs, fiber, and protein are all the required nutrient sort of quantities. And then there's 4 additional nutrients, vitamin A, C, calcium, and iron, which are all given not in physical quantities, but are in proportions. They are given, if you consume a serving of, for example, butter, you'll have some fat, some sodium content. But then if you look at most nutrition reporting, it doesn't tell you how much physical vitamin A you get. It actually gives you the percentage of the daily requirement for a 2,000 calorie diet. And so same thing for calcium, iron, and vitamin C. And so we just convert that to the proportion, with 100 being the target. If you have a 2,000 calorie diet, if you have some higher calorie amount, you could just proportionally range that up so that it's sort of on, treating the calories as sort of a mass equivalent. Just scale it up. So the data comes from this, and so the reason that we have percentages is because the nutrition facts requirement reporting, I don't even know what this food item is, but it's giving you the amount of calories in a serving, the physical size of the serving, the total fat, the cholesterol, sodium, carbohydrates, and protein, all in grams. Okay, and then the calories are in kilocalories. But then when you get to the vitamins, calcium and iron, they're just giving you as percentages of a 2,000 diet. And so this is where all that data comes from in the spreadsheet. She has students go out, get the price for whatever this food item is, divide the price by the number of servings in the package. So the price is a package price divided by the number of servings that are there. And so you're getting the per serving price in the spreadsheet, and then all the content per serving. Okay, so when we look at that spreadsheet, we'll just glance through that. But then the diet problem needs a second piece of data, the right-hand side, the requirements. Let's say it's not a 2,000 calorie diet, but it's for some 40-year-old female who exercises 3 times a week. Is there somewhere we could go find that? Well, this is the Nutrition Goals website, published by health.gov, but there are lots of places, food providers, exercise, fitness, documents online, research studies, whatever, that could give you sort of these nutrition targets And usually, you know, a easy place to find them is where there's somebody's marketing some nutrition plan that is different from the sort of standard nutrition goals. So this would be the government sort of recommendations that get published every so often. I think those are for 2016 to 2020, right? So they update those every so often. Dr. Rimble provides an example for a class looking at a 30-year-old male, basically drawn from a 2004 National Academy study, where she puts in the minimum requirement for this sort of low exercise male, 2,500 calories, 2,300 milligrams, and on and on. So these are what the sort of minimum thresholds they should be meeting every day. And that's what we call subsistence, the idea that you have to get to these targets and measure the cost. You can go above them. And for some of them, you would see that getting the minimum cost means going well above them. But for the new subsistence model, we're just looking to find that lowest cost of getting at or above these thresholds. Okay, and then you can see the bibliography here. So I'm just going to open the spreadsheet so that you can see what we mean here. So long name just means a listing of what the actual product is, and then somebody put in an abbreviation so that if you can run this directly as a spreadsheet model by putting constraints wherever you want, but probably down at the bottom of all the foods. And so this blank cell here has been left as a choice variable for someone to run it. I would assume Dr. Rimble probably just set this up and ran it. And then, so here are the price per serving. Here are the calories per serving, the fat grams per serving, the sodium content per serving. And so you can think about if you wanted to just use sort of the first, 20-ish foods, you could insert a line there, or maybe even several, I guess. And then you could just go through here and make a column right down here, that would say left-hand side, sign, right-hand side, just like we've been doing and when we did spreadsheet models. And you could say, okay, I want to put my right-hand side target for calories here. I think she said 2,500. And then that means the left-hand side formula here would just be multiply cell by cell the choice variable amount here by, so if this is 1, then we get 280 calories. That's been contributed there. If this is 2, 2 times 280 added there. So that's just a sum product formula. And I believe you'd have to put zeros in this column to make them starter values. So that's why the spreadsheet is sort of written that way. But if you wanted to collect your own information, I would suggest collecting it for these 10 things. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. These 10 categories because they're readily available. The law requires most foods, I don't know what the exemptions might be, to publish these things in the U.S. Okay, let's jump back into our presentation. Got off. Okay, here we go. And so, yeah, so that collected data is there for you to see on the class website under this Lab 5 picture. And then there's the link to the Dietary Guidelines for the coming 5-year period. There again, you see the food data. Just note that in that handout I've skipped the price information. So if you were to go out and collect your own information, be sure to grab the price. You can get the price for the bulk item, but be sure you divide it for anything by the number of servings per package, which is also required to be reported. There's what the spreadsheet data looks like. We already looked at it, and we already saw that in the handout. So these right-hand side values. So you can see that we're not doing a pure replication, because I'm not asking you to go through and get the riboflavin and thiamine, etc. that Stigler was looking at. In fact, I would suggest you just use these 10 items, come up with right-hand side values for those, and use those. Okay, so your assignment 3 is to model subsistence diet, replicating Stigler at least in principle, not in terms of his right-hand side values. Minimum total cost of a daily diet, constraint on the minimum or threshold levels of nutrition. For the reporting, I want to ask you to present or describe any modeling assumptions and reference your data sourcing. If you just use the data that's provided, that's fine. I would ask that you look up and find true right-hand side values, because the publication Dr. Rimble used to get those 10 things for that 30-year-old male are no longer available online, so we can't accurately reference those. Just describe the results, so the optimal plan, the minimum cost, what constraints are binding, and then do some description of sensitivity. So something about the food price sensitivity, like how likely is it for a small food price to cause us to switch the minimum diet plan? And then think about constraint sensitivity and what those mean. Where do you get shadow prices that show up? Those will be on the binding constraints. And just how sensitive are those, right? So we'll talk about this a little bit as we move towards submission time for the assignment 3. But I think there's sort of an important idea when we think about foods and cheap foods, which is what you tend to get in this. What are they not cheap at providing, right? What are they sort of expensive sources of? And does that call for a more detailed model, or can we just keep working with this and think about sort of on the analytical end, being sure that we are careful to include the right choices, right? Be careful about the way we include choices to get to the lowest cost, but also be careful in the comparisons we make. So you just compare your cost to Stigler's cost, and then the final sort of thing I ask for is propose some future work. Basically, what other question are you thinking about? And then assignment 4, you'll give your actual plan for your final project. Anyway, the references there at the end of that document again are just how do you think you might extend the diet plan problem? Talking about, I think one of them is about USDA's minimum or thrifty food plan. Another one is about some diet and cost information from 538.com, which is kind of interesting. So things to look at. Yeah. So this one, the 538 Science and Health blog. You can't trust what you read about nutrition. So they look at food consumption surveys and diaries, and how people are accustomed to recording their information, so that research studies, and even many of them in health economics, look at what people consume, what kind of health outcomes they get, what kind of economic sort of costs associated with health they might have and associated with their food, and how we might be concerned that the journals, those food diaries that people submit, may have some validity problems. Okay, so that's the end of our sort of part 1 here, talking about assignment 3 and for lab 5. The second thing I want to do is get us started with a topic that we're going to pursue, and it's parametric programming. And the example we have is with the diet model, so these seem to fit together. And of course, parametric programming may be something you incorporate when you begin or when you submit your final project. You may want to go through a range of prices and think about the responsiveness. But that really is what the key is here. So parametric programming means we are going to not just take parameters as fixed assumptions. We are going to identify a full range of parameter assumptions, and then consider how the optimal plan keeps adjusting. And if we're smart about that, or if there's a good a priori reason to believe there's an economic relationship, then our modeling results should provide us quantitative information to inform that economic relationship. So the example, I said we're going to do diet model, but let me give the example outside of the diet model. Think about the crop production model, and I think we will have an example in this class that relates back to Tom Hurdle's presentation, where we think about how nitrogen pricing might be important if there was some sort of cap and trade or something if there was a limit on nitrogen application or nitrogen runoff, if we had the coefficients for that, how we might range that and come up with some sort of optimal tax on the representative farm or something. So anyway, but let's think about crop production. So we assume a model has a binding land constraint, and we're interested in something that farm management professionals are always interested in. When crop prices change, how do prices of lands, the land price, respond? So what are the linkages between the crop price and land markets? So if we have a good representative crop production model, then we have a way of elaborating on this. We have a quantitative representation of what we think are best choices by crop producers. And since they are the purchasers of land, either they're landowners and they rent it sort of in effect from themselves, they buy land from a purchase market, and they buy it based on the sort of assumption of annual rents that would accrue to the land, or finally they just rent land from landowners. And so we might be interested in thinking about how the trade war affects corn prices, and if it does, how that is going to be interpreted into the shadow values of land, or in the price of land in the market. And one way we should be able to capture that is through the best offers, right? So the shadow value on land here would be the maximum willingness to pay by a corn producer for an acre of land in the land market. And so that means that we should be able to come up with a price relationship between the two. You can plot the two. You think about it as the price transmission or price linkage from the corn market to the land market, or traditionally we call this the capitalization. So how do changes in the crop market and the production, the output, get capitalized into the input market? And that's always important because land is thought of as a very limiting input in agricultural production. It is a fixed supply. If you expand to some level, right, there is generally no new land being produced. And so coming up with some approximation of that could be important. The technique that we would use here, parametric programming. So we would solve for the range of corn prices, collect all the shadow values of land, plot the two, or whatever way we want to analyze them, correlation, and then we would have some sort of benchmark, right, representative model, and it would tell us something about that relationship. Typically, you see this when we want to think about demand or supply curves, so a quantity and price of the same product, or you could think about a price of some other product and the cross-price effect on demand or supply. It's often done taking some representative model that has quite a bit of detail in it to try to think about new products or new techniques where no one has historical information yet. So the strategy when there is historical data has always been econometrics. This may be preferred if we're expecting prices to move outside of the historical range because there's no history of the price going low or very high. We may not understand the response well. But if you have a new product, there's no history of available, and so something like distiller's grain demand in feed rations is something that we studied this way. About 10 years ago, there was an ethanol boom, a lot of corn being produced, less soybeans, and feed rations for animals that had depended on soybean meal for protein were looking to distiller's grain for both energy and protein because it was this byproduct of ethanol production, and there just wasn't enough volume of trade in the market to look at it in sort of the competitive sense to get the idea of what the demand curve for distiller's grain might look like. So we modeled that up and built it into some rations and looked at some parametric program results, as well as some uncertainty in the content of distiller's grain, since it turns out they are a pretty variable feed source. It's another thing that parametric programming can be used for is if you have uncertainty in some of the coefficients, you can actually range over any of the coefficients and get an idea of just how robust the findings are to parametric uncertainty. Okay, in practice, well, we have a first cut on the parametric program right away. So when we solve, this is from our previous model, and let me just pause and switch out screens here. Okay, this is the Stigler-Gams model that we used, I guess, in Lab 4, where we looked at, so we use this as sort of a GAMS project file. You're able to download it, and it reads in the sets and the data externally. And so we've gone through and modified this. We set up all the prices to be 1 here because we need those prices in this model. And if you remember in Lab 4, I told you to turn off everything after the solve statement by typing something like on text and then off text. Well, it turns out the rest of that information, that rest of that stuff down here, was the parametric program. Okay, so we were going to range over some different evaluations of the price of wheat and calorie requirements, and look at the relationship between the between the price of calories, the quantity requirement of calories, and the price of wheat. Right. So that's what's going on there. So let's just refresh ourselves on this model. So we are going to have choices over foods, a total cost or a minimum cost constraint or minimum cost objective, some nutrient balance equations, one single objective equation called the cost balance, and then we didn't need prices for foods. Remember, these prices were all normalized to be 1, but if we're going to do a parametric program including the wheat price, then we do need those prices. So we reinstitute the prices and just say they're all 1 to start with. So the price of everything in the set, foods, is going to be 1, and so you solve for that and you get the solution, and then we move down into the loop. And so let's go back to our PowerPoint. That keeps stopping where I'm at. Okay, so we solved this, and we included the range information. We included that option to read the ranges for objective coefficients and to read the ranges, this is the range for objective coefficients and the ranges for constraint right-hand sides, right? So 3,000 calories, the shadow price for calories stays the same between 1.847 and 3.122. Okay, so these are the fixed assumptions under current. The lower and the upper give you the range or the flatness, right? So what's the range that won't cause the shadow price or the choice variable to change? And so it's, we are going to generate a linear segmented function, and so this is basically giving us the flat spot that exists around this value of 3, the flat spot around the price of 1. Or if you want to think about it and you read a sort of a more math-based textbook, it would give you the range in which the basis is unchanged. The basis is considered to be the set of x's and the set of dual variables that solve this model. Okay, so if that's our sensitivity, then we know that if we want to do parametric programming around the calorie constraint, well, we couldn't do the parametric program sort of very locally around 3,000. It couldn't be 2990 and then 3005 and then 3015. That would not help us any because it's just a big old flat spot. And then if we were thinking about the wheat price, we could not consider changes that are below 0.5%, right? Or sorry, below 5%, because that wouldn't cause the change. So we're going to have to range out beyond these if we actually want to get more than this sort of flat segment that exists, and that's what the looping in that GAMS model is set up to do. Okay, so parametric programming. There's also a chapter on this, and we have a handout. We're going to go through it a little more with a little more depth, but in sort of a functional introductory lab and diet model based approach just think of it as this. So the sensitivity ranges tell us what won't change, or what the range is that won't cause a change, but it won't tell us something we want to know, which is what are the values when you get to the next, when you get beyond that range, okay? And then if you kept going, what's the width of that new flat spot, and then what is the value that comes next and next and next? So we're actually thinking about the price-quantity relationship of calories. How does it track? How does it track if you were to treat it as a sort of supply function for pricing quantities? Well, I don't know if we should call it a supply function exactly. It's the price-quantity relationship. We'd have to do a special identification to make sure that we were treating it as the nutrient supply function. So repeated solution, we just basically iterate over multiple values, and then we track the solution values from each iteration. So that just means we're going to make a recording, and basically we're going to ask GAMS, solve again, and while you're at it, keep track of that solution, and then solution 2 and solution 3, and then we have to introduce these parameter changes one at a time. Okay, so it's important that we don't do a wholesale change, because then we won't have the marginal effect. So we want these to be marginal. Well, they don't have to be purely marginal, but they have to be a single increment to a single piece, right? So it has to be ceteris paribus changes. If we leave the parameters intact, we'll let the parameters interact. Those dual values, right? Even the shadow values are going to depend not only on what the right-hand side is and whether you're inside or outside of the range, but they depend on the prices in the model. Those shadow values are an interpretation of the resource or the limitation cost that associated with the model, but the economic values derive directly from the objective, and the objective is built directly from the choices weighted by the price information we give. So we start changing the weights, the price information, then we could be changing the shadow values. I give a land constraint, land demand example. So a farm producer with a limitation on land, you're getting a pretty direct identification there of land demand. So solve for different right-hand side values of the land, basically saying what if they could rent more land, what's the willingness to pay, rent more land, rent more land. If you measure those shadow prices, you're getting the willingness to pay for the next unit. And so you could think about tracking out that land constraint, but then also how does a 10% increase in the price of corn shift that land demand function? Okay, so managing many solutions, well, that's a programming environment is very good in that. So for large models, it may take many solutions for us to actually get over the feasible space conveniently. And if we were doing it in a spreadsheet, we would get tired of resolving and writing down or copying and pasting the results every time. So the programming environment is quite well suited for that. You can set up the results, collect them pretty easily and output them. And then of course, if you need a tweak, if you need to change the increments in something, or you want to add on another layer, everything you've already done is still there and documented. All the steps are reproducible from the previous incarnation. If you're in a spreadsheet and solving, you have to go back and recreate all of that every time, unless you are coding the spreadsheet, right? So there is Visual Basic, which would allow you to enter instructions for the spreadsheet to redo everything over and over, which you're certainly welcome to do. I just have not had a lot of experience with it. So we use the Stigler diet model. I don't know that you're going to get the updated version of this with PP in it. I think I just ended up overriding the diet model. So when this slide was made, sorry, this was diet parametric program, but I think the loop was already in there. It's the same model from Lab 4, has the programming statements at the end to look for what we would call sort of the caloric supply functions. The right-hand side of calories is expanded, the shadow price of calories is recorded, and then we're looking for how the wheat price impact shifts that constraint. So let's just review really quick. I've already opened the code once. Everything was $1 worth of the food item, so we got rid of the prices. We need those back, so that's where we put the price in. And then when I mentioned that options file for getting the ranges, that Cplex solver in GAMS will go through, solve the model with using sort of a simplex type approach, but it will also reproduce the kind of ranges we get from Excel output, and so we can generate that by using this. One, we have that options file provided called diet, and then we put this instruction here after the solve to generate that. Okay, so the basics though, build the programming loops to do the parametric program. So the statement is basically, or the function is called a loop. It basically says, gives an instruction to do something, and while you're at it, keep doing that until you meet some condition. And so in GAMS, the typical way to set this up would be to instruct it that you're giving it a loop, open parentheses, and everything in the parentheses is contained inside the loop. And then you give it a set, and that set is going to be the controller for the loop. It's going to tell it to, for every unit, or sorry, every element of this set, execute a set of programming statements. Come back, check, is there a new set element that you haven't used yet? Do that one, go through, do it again until you run out of set elements, and then you can exit the loop and move past the semicolon. So we call that the loop being controlled by the GAMS set. One loop execution, one set of these programming statements will be completed for each value in that controlling set, and then all programming statements will execute to the end until it gets to the closing parentheses, or and return to the controlling set. Or it's possible you might have some end condition if something happens before you get to the end of the set. You start hitting solutions that say they're unbounded or infeasible, or you get something where it's trying to divide by 0, then you might exit the loop and stop iterating, especially if you had a giant parametric range set up. We talked about, back in the slide right before I'm not sure where, but the price of wheat affecting, the price of wheat, the purchase price of wheat from the Stigler model affecting the price of calories, the shadow price of calories. And so that means we actually have two things we're iterating over, the price of wheat and the right-hand side of calories. So we're trying to range over the quantity of calories using the right-hand side. We're ranging over the price of wheat, right, where it sets the level of shadow prices as well. And so with those two different things, to keep the sort of ceteris paribus conditions going, we need to have nested loops. So that means two sets. The first loop, operating or controlled by set 1, has programming statements, and part of those programming statements are another loop, right? So inside of the first loop are these programming statements plus the introduction of a new loop. And when you get inside the second loop, this becomes the controlling set. Execute all of our programming statements inside of this loop. Don't move back out until you've finished the controlling set 2. Then when you hit the end condition, you can move past this, and you see there could be some additional programming statements relevant to the outer loop. Okay? And then when you get to here, if there's another iteration on the controlling set for the outer loop, go through, do the programming statements, do the internal loop or the inside loop again till you exit it, move back out, you got another one, do the statements, do the new loop, stay inside of that loop until you finish it again, until you get to the terminal effect or the terminating condition for the outer loop. Okay, so if you have 5 set elements in the outer loop, 5 set elements in the inner loop, you're going to get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're going to get 5 times 5. You're going to get 25 executions here. Okay, so our coding example, well, we need those controlling sets, so we just set one up to be iteration over the price of wheat, and this is the way you can write sort of a shorthand PW1 star PW10, as long as the numbers are iterating. This will give you every whole number PWI from 1 to 10. And then down here I have iterate over the calories as another set element. This will give you cal 1, cal 2, cal 3, cal 4, cal 5. Okay, so that's what that star abridgment is. It just gives you every whole number, every integer appended to whatever this prefix is. We need our new parameter that'll collect all of our results, and so the loop is going to be controlled by the calories and the price of wheat. And so this just says here's a sensitivity matrix that we're going to look at. Iterate over the calories, iterate over the price of wheat, and when you get the third iteration over calories and the fifth price of wheat, record the value that I want right there. And that price, that recorded value is going to be the shadow price of land, or sorry, the shadow price of calories. We're iterating over the quantity of calories and the price of wheat. The variable we want to iterate or to collect for the sensitivity matrix is the shadow price of calories. Here's the loop fully fleshed out. So we begin the first iteration. We're on the outer loop. We set the calorie constraint to 1.5. At this point, loop internally, solve the diet model. When you get to the end of the inner loop, add 0.5 to the right hand side of calories. You go back to right here. Now you're solving for the right hand side equals 2. Then go again. This right hand side is equal to 2.5. Then when you jump out of this loop, when you complete this controlling set, you get down here, and whatever the price of wheat was set outside of the loop, you're going to add 0.2 onto that. So I think it was set at 0.5. So now you've got 0.7. You run this, you reset the calories back to their lowest value, 1.5, before you get into the calorie loop for a second time. So now the first solution here is 1.5. Go through it again at 2.0, 2.5. Then you jump out, and now you'll be solving for the next wheat price. Collect all that as we go somewhere. Right here, it's collecting the calorie. This is the calorie constraint. This is the collect the marginal, so that's the shadow price on the calorie constraint being collected each time. You see right here we have sensitivity matrix. It says whatever the current iteration on the calories and the current iteration on the price of wheat is, use those two indexes and set that price. When you run it, you end up with 50 solutions. We've got 10 iterations on the price of wheat, 5 on the calories, and this is what you get. And that's what we're going to play around with a little bit as we go back into our example and talk about parametric programming as a technique just a little bit. So we'll have a handout in our next class on Thursday that we talk through, as well as discussing any questions you might have on the final project and working with the diet to get more than subsistence and think about sort of what a relevant economic question might be. That closes us out. This ends our replacement class for that we're calling Lab 5, and keep in mind the documents that go with it. The handout for this Lab 5 basically is just introducing the final project, but also assignment 3, which is due November 7th.